Thank you very much for having me. I want to make the point that saving the market economy necessitates strengthening incentives to compete. And why is that? So a famous economist once said, capitalism without competition is like religion without God. It just doesn't work. And to have competition, you need competitive incentives. So that's the idea. This is not a new idea. So many in this room will have read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and learned that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker or the brewer that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. So the baker wakes up in the morning, wants to steal market share from the rival bakery across the street. And how does one do that? Well, you innovate, you make better bread, you innovate in production process, bake the bread cheaper, as to steal market share from the rival. And the rival does the same. And the result is cheaper and better tasting bread, not higher corporate profits, but cheaper and better bread. That's what we call welfare or the wealth of nations. But we don't live in the time of Adam Smith anymore. The baker does not own the bakery. It's a publicly traded firm or a private equity-owned chain. And if the baker doesn't manage and own the bakery, you need the shareholders to push management to innovate, to compete aggressively. And the trouble is that we have arrived at a point in history that is illustrated on the slide behind me, where most firms, most important shareholders don't have incentives to push their managers to compete aggressively and maximize that individual firm's value. So to give just one example, what I have behind me is a list of the 10 largest shareholders of America's 6 largest airlines. That's as of a few years ago. And what you see is that there's quite a bit of overlap between them. So Berkshire Hathaway is Warren Buffett's investment firm. That is the largest shareholder of 3 of the 4 largest airlines, and the 3rd largest in another. And on the ranks are Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, that's the big 3 asset management firms, Fidelity, and other active managers. Now, what would happen if Delta started to drop prices, to steal market share from Southwest, or innovate, right? United tried to steal market share from Delta. Well, what would happen is prices would drop, customers would be happy. But would it make Warren Buffett happy? And the answer is obviously not, no? So Warren Buffett only gets lower revenues and total portfolio profits. Would it make Vanguard happy? And the answer is no. Would it make BlackRock happy? And the answer is no. So the question is, if it doesn't make the largest shareholders happy, why would Delta drop prices and start a price war? And the answer is, they wouldn't and they don't. Okay? So this is not rocket science. This is pretty obvious, you might say. In the words of Becky Quick at CNBC at the time, she says, you know, Warren, it does occur to me, though, if you're building up such a significant stake in all these major players, is that anything that's like monopolistic behavior? So, yeah, it's pretty obvious. Now, to be clear, the concern is not so much that the common owners of competitors would actively discourage competition between their portfolio firms. The concern is that the major shareholders don't actively encourage firms to compete aggressively. They leave them alone. That's the concern. It is not about increased incentives to collude. It is about decreased incentives to compete. It's a reduction in the incentives to compete as what you would need in a market economy. So let me illustrate this final point to conclude my remarks. Let's take an airline that's been known to compete quite aggressively, again, in America. That's, I skipped a slide. Well, my point was, sorry for that. My point was, this doesn't only happen in the airlines industry, this is everywhere. This is probably obvious to most of you. Vanguard by now controls more than 10% of the average S&P 500 firm. BlackRock is not far behind, and so forth. But what I did want to illustrate is that there's exceptions to the rule. So here in the top left, you see Virgin America's ownership structure. So the largest one is Richard Branson, followed by his friends at Cyrus Capital Partners. And jointly, they essentially control the firm. But without, at the same time, holding large financial stakes in the competing airlines, as you previously saw. Okay? So there's also the odd company left. Professor Dorn called them superstar firms in the first lecture of the day. Amazon has a large shareholder, or had at the time. He's a bit smaller now. Walmart has a very large shareholder that does not own large stakes in the competitors as well. Those are the firms that compete aggressively innovate, to reduce costs, and you know, there are side effects of that, but that describes their behavior. Now, how is it that these superstar firms' largest shareholders push management and help their firms to steal market shares from rivals? So let me show you. This here is Richard Branson putting on a flight attendant costume and lipstick to, well, you know, promote Virgin America services and try to steal market share away from United and Delta Airlines. Okay? Here's the thing. I've never seen Warren Buffett do the same, or Larry Fink. And you smile, because that's absurd. It would be absurd if Warren Buffett put on lipstick, A, but it would be more absurd if he first did it at Delta Airlines to steal away market share from United, then did it at United to steal market share away from Delta. Well, but that's the counterfactual, no? That every company would be owned by one large player that does not own stakes in the competitors and pushes the firms to compete aggressively. So, with few exceptions, in public equity markets, the baker and the butcher no longer have incentives to compete as aggressively as in the textbook, as in Adam Smith's textbook case, because their owners simply don't have an interest in stealing market shares from rivals. So if we want to save the market economy, we have to find a way for the owners of corporations to have an interest in caring about the particular firm again, with the same vigilance and dedication as Adam Smith's butcher and baker. And if we don't do that, then we need to stop complaining about the market economy not delivering on its promise, because it never promised to work without the right incentives. That's it. Thank you.